if you are a parent who is trying to move away from disrespectful practices and your discipline, if you want to stop spanking, maybe timeouts, maybe yelling, and then you're like, okay, so, but what is the consequence when my child purposefully pushes his brother? When my child purposefully spills something, or when they don't do their homework? Is there any consequences when it comes to gentle parenting? Well, the good news is that there are consequences. And then, as so good news that we're going to discover why of this a little bit later is that consequences are overrated because alone they don't correct behavior. On this podcast episode, we are going to talk about consequences that work, how we combine consequences with other strategies and other things or other tools so our children truly learn positive behavior. That's going to be the content or the topic for this podcast episode. And let's do it. Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Parenting with Understanding podcast. This is your host, Marcela Collier, head coach of HIC Parenting Education. And let's talk about consequences. So, I remember when I started this journey of respectful parenting, I was very sure about what I didn't want for my kids. I didn't want them to raise them with chancla culture. I'm a Latina. My chancla landed on my head multiple times growing up. I didn't want my children to fear me. I didn't want my children to not want to have a relationship with me or to be scared of me. So I knew that chancla culture was not going to cut it, and yelling as well. It wasn't going to cut it. But I'm like, okay, I still need to discipline them. If they're still going to, quote unquote, misbehave, so how do I do to keep the limits in my house to teach them positive behavior while I keep a respectful approach? And then I went on a 10-year journey. Along the way, I became a parenting coach and I worked with thousands of parents on this. So I'm going to show you the framework of consequences that work. And this is part of the workshop that we are going to have this week. Yes, it's going to be tomorrow at 9 a.m. PST. And I'm going to show you the full framework to go from frustration to correcting behavior the long term, and consequences are just a small topic and a small aid of all the things that need to be in place for children to fully learn positive behavior the long term. So this is a $7 workshop. Like if you cannot go to Starbucks today, you can afford this. All you have to do is go to hicparenting.com or open the description of this podcast episode. If you are watching from YouTube, just open the description as well. And the link is there. You can join us for just $7 live workshop. You are going to have me to answer your questions as well. So it's going to be a live interaction and you're going to live with the framework to correct behaviors the long term. Okay, so let's take a little small portion of this framework and let's talk about consequences. Because consequences, to the contrary, that many people think that that's what discipline is, the consequence you give a child for a misbehavior, that's not it. Consequences are just a little small aid on the learning process. So, what are consequences? Consequences are the natural effect of a behavior. So there are natural and there are logical consequences. Natural consequences are related to the direct effect without the adult's intervention of a child's action. So yesterday, my twins, they were playing water guns, and then the rule was water guns are just to, you can water gun your brother on the legs, on the stomach, on the back, but respect the face, not on the face. And one of my children, he broke that rule, and his brother didn't want to play with him anymore because it was uncomfortable to feel that water gun on his face. So that's a natural consequence. The child broke the rule, the other child didn't like it, the other child said, "Hey, sorry, I don't want to play with you anymore." Natural consequences are great teachers because children don't see us as, "Oh, you're the one imposing the consequence, you're against me." None of that. They just live in the natural effect of their action. And then his brother didn't want to play with him anymore. And I would say an hour later, they were playing again, and the incident resolved. It did not happen because the natural consequence taught my son, "Hey, if I do this again, my brother, he's not going to like it." Now, why do I say that natural consequences alone are not necessarily what children need to correct their behavior the long term? So let's go underneath what happened here. So my sons, they knew the rules. They knew going in that I could play shooting at the leg, at the back, at a tree, but not at the face because it doesn't feel comfortable. The water doesn't feel comfortable at the face. So he knew that going in, but there was something that impaired my son to follow through. And this is related to self control. So, self control is an executive functioning skill of the prefrontal cortex. And when children get overly excited, I'm talking about children 12 and under, their self control lessens because their body is full of adrenaline that takes energy to their limbs. It fills their limbs with energy, and they don't have the brain development and brain capacity to control their impulses. So, was it that my son did not want to follow the rule? Possibly he got so excited that he was out of his window of self control tolerance, and he was at a point that he was not able to control impulses anymore. So, that being said, him seeing his brother now wanting to play with him may help him control himself for a little bit, but just for a little bit until he starts getting out of his window of comfort, out of his window of self regulation, and his brain is not able to back him up anymore. So, on the workshop, we are going to work on what are other skills that children need to develop in order to be fully successful with the behavior that we want to teach them, right? So, here I know that it's not just about the natural consequence, but it's about keeping my son within his window of tolerance. The ISO was about 10 minutes, and then he started getting overly excited and not control impulses anymore. So I knew that that game was going to be just 10 minutes to be within the rule. Otherwise, he would not be able to follow through, even if he wants to follow through. So that's how you correct behavior the long term. What are the skills besides the consequence that will aid the consequence to fully work, that will aid the rule to fully work? And you're like, okay, but I have a lot of questions. But what about when they're hitting each other? But what about with that? We're going to keep talking as we progress in this episode. But if you want the full spectrum of how to correct behavior the long term, again, it's in my upcoming workshop that is going to be tomorrow, May 29th of 2024. If you are watching this podcast episode at a later time, you can purchase the replay for $7. So I encourage you to attend live so I can coach you directly, or buy the replay for $7, and it is an hour and a half, instead of just 20 minutes of you being here with me. Okay, so let's move on with consequences. So consequence that work is a consequence that is directly related to the behavior, natural consequence, if possible. And when you pair that up with seeing what's keeping your daughter, your son, your child from following that certain rule, and what support system you can place around that so your child is able to successfully follow that rule. So that's how consequences could work. So let's move on to logical consequences. So logical consequences are imposed by the parent, but they have to be directly correlated. So a timeout, go to your room and think about what you did, is not directly correlated with my son learning self regulation skills. So he does control his impulses of squirting water at his brother's face. So it would not work. It temporarily stops the behavior, but the behavior comes back. Research has shown that timeout does, in fact, work to stop a behavior, but it does not work correcting a behavior. Correcting a behavior and stopping a behavior are two separate things. When we correct a behavior, we see the child choosing to do better over time. When we're stopping a behavior, we are shutting down the behavior with a consequence. The child feels forced to stop the behavior, but the behavior reappears. So that's what timeout, yelling, spanking, and taking things away, that's what they do. They stop, but they don't correct behaviors. And they leave us feeling disconnected. And they feel us living like, oh, I wonder if I'm doing more bad than good. Like it does not feel good. Whereas natural consequences like, oh yeah, your brother doesn't want to play with you. Yes, because when you squirt water at his face, it doesn't feel nice, right? Let's move on to logical consequences. Logical consequences are directly related to the behavior, but they're imposed by the parent. On this regard, when natural consequences are not safe, then we step in with logical consequences. So I didn't want my other son to shoot at the face again. So I didn't want that to happen again because he could go to his eye, he could get hurt. So I knew that my son's window of tolerance of controlling impulses was about 10 minutes. So before the 10-minute mark, I said, okay, guys, let's change the activity. I decided to impose that consequence, not because the tone was not okay, because you did not listen before and you squirt at your brother's face, you shoot at your brother's face. Then no, it was not that energy, that vibe. It was like, okay, guys, I think before we get too excited and we start doing things that we know is not allowed, let's take a break. Let's go in, let's change the environment, let's be done with this. So, those are logical consequences. We impose them, they're directly related to the behavior. They're not communicated in anger. They are not communicated in blame, shame, guilt, none of that. And children see that we are actually helping them. It may not always feel comfortable to the child to follow the consequence because my children wanted to keep on playing, and one of them had a little tantrum, but they feel safe and you feel good with you. So that's, I would say, the biggest difference between gentle parenting consequences and punishment, that we feel good about it. We feel that we are actually helping our children and not hurting our children. So that paired up again with skill development. Remember that the reason why my son was not able to follow through is because his window of tolerance of self control is 10 minutes. So I could increase that window of tolerance by providing my son with better skills, better skills to manage his impulses, to control his emotions, right? I could work on breathing exercises. I have a breathing exercises poster. It's free, downloadable. I'm going to leave a link tab below as well in the description, or go to hicparenting.com, or other coping strategies. So those are consequences that work. Consequences that are respectful, that are age appropriate, that are correlated, natural or logical, that are paired up with kindness, with consideration for their children's needs and feelings, and very importantly, that are paired up with skill development, with social emotional skills. So our children are prepared and prepare to handle things better in the future. If you like this episode, would you leave me a positive review? Just open the description of this podcast episode and leave me a positive review and let me know how it could help you in your parenting. Remember that it only takes understanding of yourself and of your children to transform your parenting. And follow us at High Impact Club on all our socials: TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. We are there every day helping parents bring peace to their parenting, and raise emotionally healthy children. I'll see you next time. Bye.